In the last episode, we looked at the disconnect between economic headlines and lived experience. The numbers said one thing, people felt another. Today, we're going deeper into that gap. Because there's a question most economic reports don't ask. What does growth actually mean? We're told the economy is growing. We see the proof. GDP up, markets up, corporate profits up. But growth of what and for whom? Because if you look closely at the numbers, something strange emerges. The economy can expand while most people's lives stay the same or get harder. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a measurement problem. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
When numbers tell half the story. Let's start with the most important number in economics, gross domestic product. GDP measures the total value of goods and services produced in a country. When GDP grows, economists say the economy is healthy. Politicians celebrate. Markets respond positively. In 2023, U.S. GDP reached $27.36 trillion, a record high. Sounds impressive, and in aggregate terms it is. But here's what GDP doesn't tell you. It doesn't measure how that wealth is distributed. It doesn't account for whether people can afford housing, healthcare, or education. It doesn't distinguish between productive investment and speculative bubbles.
GDP counts a $5 million luxury condo sale the same way it counts $5 million spent on public infrastructure. Both add to growth, but only one benefits the majority. When a billionaire buys a superyacht, that's GDP growth. When a hospital closes in a rural town, that also affects GDP. Medical debt collection, ironically, counts as economic activity. GDP grows, but does that mean we're getting richer?
The productivity puzzle. Here's another metric we hear constantly: productivity. U.S. worker productivity has increased by over 70% since 1979. American workers produce significantly more value per hour than they did 45 years ago. Logic would suggest if workers produce more, they should earn more. But that's not what happened. During the same period, median wages grew by only 12% when adjusted for inflation. Productivity up 70%, wages up 12%. Where did the difference go? Corporate profit margins reached 70-year highs in 2021-2022. CEO compensation increased by 1,460% since 1978, while typical worker pay rose just 18%. Workers became more efficient, companies became more profitable, executives became wealthier, but the average worker? They're working harder for relatively less. Economists call this decoupling, when productivity gains no longer translate into wage gains. Most people just call it frustrating. The cost of living reality. Even wage statistics can mislead without context. The median household income in the U.S. is approximately $74,580. That's higher than in 2000, even adjusting for inflation. Progress, right? But look at what happened to costs. In 2000, the median home cost 3.5 times the median annual income. Today, it's 5.6 times. Housing went from difficult to mathematically improbable for many. College tuition increased 180% after inflation. Student loan debt now exceeds $1.7 trillion. Health insurance premiums for a family of 4 went from $6,438 to $23,968.
So yes, incomes rose, but essential costs rose faster. The Economic Policy Institute calculates that for a family of 4 to maintain basic security, they need between $75,000 and $100,000, depending on location. The median household income now barely covers stability. This isn't about wanting luxuries, it's about affording breathing room.
Where the wealth actually went. But the picture becomes clearer when you look at wealth, not just income. The top 10% of Americans hold nearly 67% of all wealth. The bottom 50%, that's 165 million people, share just 2.6%. And this isn't stable, it's accelerating. During the pandemic, U.S. billionaires saw their wealth increase by $1.7 trillion in just 2 years. Meanwhile, median household savings actually decreased. When we say the economy is growing, this is what's growing.
What market records really mean. Much is made of stock market performance as a measure of economic health. The S&P 500 has returned over 200% in the last decade. Remarkable growth. But here's who benefits. The wealthiest 10% own 89% of all stocks. The bottom 50% own just 1%. A 2023 survey found that 58% of Americans own no stock at all, not even through retirement accounts. So when financial news celebrates market records, it's celebrating gains that bypass the majority. For most people, those numbers might as well be happening on another planet. The inflation nobody talks about. Official inflation shows around 3 to 4% recently. Headlines call that progress. But inflation isn't experienced equally. If you don't own a home, official measures don't capture that houses became 50% more expensive in 5 years. If you pay for childcare and groceries instead of buying electronics, the average rate feels disconnected from your reality. MIT's research tracking real-time prices often shows higher inflation than official numbers, particularly for lower-income households who spend more on necessities. The number depends on what you're buying and who you are, what we're not measuring. But perhaps the deepest flaw is this: growth metrics ignore quality of life entirely. GDP doesn't measure time with family, job security, mental health, freedom from constant financial stress. America's GDP per capita is among the highest in the world, yet life expectancy has actually declined from 78.9 years in 2014 to 76.4 in 2022. This is virtually unprecedented in developed nations during peacetime. Over 100,000 Americans die annually from drug overdoses alone. The rate of deaths of despair keeps rising. The U.S. ranks 23rd in the World Happiness Report, behind Costa Rica, a country with 1/5 our GDP per capita. More work, shorter lives, less happiness, but higher GDP. Something doesn't add up. The debt underneath. Here's what else growth numbers don't show. Household debt reached $17.5 trillion in 2024. Credit card debt alone exceeds $1.1 trillion, with average interest rates over 20%. Federal Reserve data shows households increasingly use credit cards for basic expenses when income doesn't cover costs. We're not consuming more because we're richer. We're consuming more because we're borrowing more. That looks like growth in the data, but it's actually fragility.
different picture. Compare the U.S. to other developed nations. Americans spend $12,555 per capita on health care, more than twice the developed world average. Yet our life expectancy is lower than all comparable nations. American students graduate with an average of $37,000 in debt. In Germany, France, and Norway, public university is essentially free. The U.S. is the only developed nation with no guaranteed paid parental leave, no mandatory vacation, no guaranteed sick days. These aren't failures of GDP. GDP is high. These are failures of distribution and priorities. The growth that doesn't build. Increasingly, growth comes not from making things people need, but from financial engineering. In 2023, corporations spent $923 billion in share buybacks, purchasing their own stock to boost prices. That's nearly $1 trillion not invested in wages, research, or improvements. It went to inflating stock values, benefiting wealthy shareholders and executives. This counts as economic growth, but it creates no products, no jobs, no tangible value. Growth on paper, extraction in practice. Measuring the wrong thing. The fundamental issue is this: we've built an entire system around maximizing GDP, but GDP was never designed to measure well-being. Simon Kuznets, who developed GDP in the 1930s, explicitly warned against using it to measure national welfare. He said, "The welfare of a nation cannot be inferred from national income alone." Yet, that's exactly what we do. We've optimized for a metric that doesn't measure what people actually care about: security, opportunity, health, time, dignity. And in optimizing for GDP, we've created an economy that grows while people struggle. What the data actually shows. Look at what we know. Most people are working more hours, earning less relative to costs, carrying more debt, experiencing more stress, seeing less opportunity than previous generations, while aggregate economic growth continues. This isn't a paradox, it's the system working as designed. Because growth never specified growth for whom. A simple truth. Think about someone you know who's working full-time, maybe 2 jobs, doing everything right, and still struggling to get ahead. That's not a personal failure. That's not laziness or bad choices. It's an economy that measures success by the wrong standard.
We're told we're getting richer. The economy is getting richer. Most people are not. And maybe the real question isn't whether the economy is growing. Maybe it's simpler than that. If most people work harder and have less, struggle to afford basics, carry overwhelming debt, and see their children facing worse prospects, then what exactly are we calling prosperity? Next episode, we'll look at how this happened, the specific decisions and structural changes that decoupled growth from shared well-being, because understanding the mechanics makes it less mysterious and less inevitable.